I'd like to start today's show with a poem I wrote a number of years ago called Texas Braggin'. This is from a story that gets told quite a bit, but I first heard it from my old friend Clay Mitchell. On a roundup in the spring, way back in '82, a Texas man was riding with some northern buckaroos. Now, this Lone Star cowboy is just what you'd expect from any Texas puncher with a lick of self-respect. He'd say, in Texas, everything's a whole lot better and bigger. The punchers all are punchier, and near as I can figure, the horses all run faster, and the cattle all are tougher, the rivers all run wider, and the work's a whole lot rougher. Well, he commenced to bragging every day of every week, till it riled them buckaroos just to hear him speak. And after talking it over, they came to decide they'd have to somehow damage this bragging cowboy's pride. And since he had said them Texans were so tough, they'd have to pull a trick to call this puncher's bluff. So one day, while they was fording a river, they happened to come across a couple of snapping turtles a-hiding in the moss. Well, they put them turtles in his bedroll and threw it back in the wagon. Figured that would stop his never-ending bragging. So that night, when he got his bedroll out and laid it on the ground, them buckaroos all walked over and they kind of gathered round to watch him stick his feet down in that roll, thinking it would be a pretty funny show. Well, sure enough, he stuck his feet in, and he jerked them right back out, and he kind of had a surprised look upon his snout when he flipped the bedroll open, and he yelled out to the crew, "Well, looky there, boys. Bed bugs, and little bitty ones, too." Howdy, folks. This is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Pipp Gillette. Pipp is a musician in the old-time cowboy folk tradition, and he raises cattle on the family ranch near Lovelady, Texas, which was started by his grandfather in 1912. He and his late brother Guy performed for many years in one of the best-loved duos in cowboy music, the Gillette Brothers. Pipp now performs as a solo artist and plays guitar, banjo, harmonica, and the bones. I sat down with Pipp in a hotel room in Lubbock, Texas, where he was in town performing for the National Cowboy Symposium, and we recorded this interview. Here's Pipp Gillette.
Well, my grandparents were both born in a little community west of Lovelady, Texas, that was known as Nevilles Prairie. I always thought that had a great sound to it, Nevilles Prairie. And of course, there in East Texas, any actual natural open spot was known as a prairie and usually had a name because it was so unusual, because everything was covered up in brush and, trees and forest. So this was somehow some kind of a spot that apparently didn't grow trees for some reason. Anyway, it was known as Nevilles Prairie, and they lived there west of Lovelady, and my grandfather and grandmother got married in sort of an unusual way, in that apparently her parents were not that big enthusiastic about Hoyt, which was my grandfather. Virgil Hoyt Porter was his name. A couple of great old names. Virgil Hoyt Porter. And Lucy Inez Thornton was her maiden name, Thornton. Lucy Inez Thornton. Anyway, they apparently met at this friend of theirs' house one evening that they had arranged with this friend, and Lucy shows up, and then Hoyt shows up, and then this minister shows up, and they got married, just, on the spot. I mean, they planned it, but nobody else had planned it. Nobody else knew about it, and except the friend. She knew it was going to happen. Anyway, after the ceremony, they both went back to their respective homes and didn't actually live together until, as quickly as he could. He bought a home and on credit, and they finally actually were officially married, but it was kind of unusual. And the story went that he bought this home from this woman and about 30 acres, I think it was. And again, it was on this time, it was on share, you know what I mean? It was going to be X amount, so many months, whatever. Well, suddenly something changed about her situation, and she needed the money right away. So he bought a boxcar load of ribbon cane syrup, which was made right there in that area. Ribbon cane syrup was a big product. It was right up there. I think it followed, cotton and timber was like ribbon cane syrup was a huge deal, which they produced there locally, in that part of the state. And he knew very well that they didn't have it out in places like Lubbock and other places in the state. So he rented a boxcar full of ribbon cane syrup and got it hauled out to somewhere, I don't know where, and got it on a sidecar, off on a sideline there, and sat there and sold all this ribbon cane syrup and came home and paid her off, bought the home. Was able to just pay it in cash. So those are the kinds of things that you can't do today, seemingly. But it was the kind of thing that he had an interesting mind, I remember as a kid, he'd come through the house, in the early morning in the dark black, and he'd go, "Off to the races, boys." And, you got the feeling that was his, there was a certain amount of competition that he felt, that was what it was all about, sort of. Anyway, so yeah, that's my mother's mother and father. And she, of course, was born there in Lovelady, Texas. And my grandfather was raising cattle and cotton. And cotton was the big deal in that part of the state at that time. And cattle were secondary. You had all your crops were fenced in, and your cattle were actually fenced out, and it was open range. And they were just running in the timberlands, and it was very loose operation. You'd go out and gather your cattle, maybe once a year, and you'd gather them anywhere you could. If there was a set of pens somewhere, you'd ask these people, "Can I use your set of pens?" And you just pen these cattle there, and you didn't have any. It was just sort of a real loose deal. And of course, this is the days of screwworms. So the losses, it was a very secondary kind of an operation. Well, screwworm was a nightmare. It was just a constant problem. A fly would lay eggs in any open wound on any cattle, and if you had a calf born, it would lay these eggs in the navel of the calf, and it would lay eggs in any open wound, and these eggs then would hatch as worms that would eat their way through the cattle and eat their way out, and it didn't necessarily kill them, I don't think, always. Fortunately, I was really, they'd eradicated it by the time I really knew what the heck was going on. In the mid-'60s to the late 60s, the screwworm was eradicated. Anyway, it was something that you just had, very important that you didn't calve in the summertime when flies were around. So you avoided having any kind of open wound in that period. And that was a nightmare. You just had to check cattle all the time for screwworm infestations. So that was a major problem. But cotton was the big deal, and cattle was very secondary, and that all started to dramatically change by the time I came along in the 50s. Cotton was really phasing out, and cattle were taking over. And now it's, that area of Houston County is one of the biggest cow-calf operations in the state. It's not the big ranches, of course, not the famous ranches or the big ranches, but it produces more cattle than any part of the state. By the time I came along in the 50s, cattle was almost exclusively it. I remember going out to some cotton fields and visiting and, just sort of seeing these cotton fields, but that was about it. So it was really, I think by the late 50s, cotton was over in East Texas. My mother was born in the original place that he bought with the ribbon cane syrup, and then they moved very quickly out to the farm where he was raising cotton, and they had this home out there, which was a 2-story house. They lived in the second floor, and my grandmother ran a commissary store on the ground floor. And there was this, of course, in that period, the 30s and the 20s, to go to Lovelady, which was, say, 14 miles away, was a big deal. That was not something you could just do and say, well, I'm going to run to town, and, 30 minutes later you're back. It was a big production, to go with a team of mules and a wagon and horseback and whatever. So she was obviously bringing this stuff to the community, making it easier for people and making, obviously, a living out of it, helping make a living. And so then when my mother got to be school age, they moved back to the original house where she was born, and my grandmother opened a general store in Lovelady, in downtown Lovelady. So she had the general store. My grandfather was, doing his cattle operation, phasing out the cotton, and so my mother grew up, in this general store. And my grandmother had everything in the world in it. It really was a little sort of mini Walmart in the sense you could get, groceries, you could get pharmaceutical stuff, you could get notions and all the clothing, stuff to make clothing. You got the patterns and the cloth and everything in thread and, all the stuff you needed to make clothes, because, of course, people were making their own clothes then. And, you could buy boots, you could buy meat, you could buy, it was quite an amazing little store. So my mother, when she got to be college kind of age, she spent a year in Denton at what was then called the Texas Women's College, I believe it was called, and now it's something else. But she didn't seemingly get along that well, didn't feel comfortable, it wasn't working for her, and came home. And my grandmother had Vogue magazine in the store so that people could keep up with the fashions, and be up to date, and because she didn't think that because we were in Lovelady, Texas, that we couldn't be with the times, So anyway, my mother saw this ad in the back of Vogue magazine for a fashion design school, and she was very good at sewing and making her own stuff, and could do all kinds of the real, making of clothing. So she thought that would be something she was really interested in. So she ended up going to New York to go study at Trapphagen School of Fashion. And Mrs. Trapphagen was married to William R. Lee, the Western artist, painter, who was very much contemporary of like Frederick Remington. And Remington died very young, and William R. Lee was now an elderly man in the 50s. And he would take the students to the Bronx Zoo. He would take all these women to the Bronx Zoo. That was one of his traditional things to do, to see what the master and the Lord had provided with fashion design for these animals, zebras, and look at all these animals and how that related to, fashion and the idea of how design should work, So he was sort of a part of the school in that sense, anyway. And my mother became good friends with both of them. And so she's studying fashion design there in New York City, which I always thought this is the early 40s, and I thought that was a very bold move, She didn't know anybody in New York and left Lovelady a population of about 500 and went off and did that. And my father, well, then the Mr. Lee and his wife suggested that she get a job working as a waitress in this restaurant that they liked called the Threefold. And they thought it would be good for her to have a reason to be out in the world, sort of, and not sort of, just sort of be in her own apartment and whatever, and kind of get her out there. And so she was waitressing at this place called the Threefold, which was apparently a vegetarian restaurant, which was kind of interesting and strange. But so she was waitressing. My father, meanwhile, was born in Minnesota, and his father was during the Depression, during the 20s, he was an organizer of Lions clubs. So he was going around organizing these business groups into these Lions clubs to help the community sort of survive the Depression. And he traveled all the time, and so my father moved constantly all around the country and ended up living for the most of his life, I suppose, in Connecticut. And anyway, he was out in Chicago visiting his father, and he got involved with the theater group out there and got some kind of a scholarship. They suggested he go out to New York and study there, and he was studying theater in New York with Michael Chekhov, who was the brother of Anton Chekhov, the theater playwright. Anton Chekhov wrote like the Brothers Karamazov and a whole bunch of plays. Well, Michael Chekhov was in New York, and he had an acting school. So he was studying with Michael Chekhov, and she was studying at the Trapegan School of Fashion, and suddenly a friend of his, an acting, he had all these obviously other acting, students, one of them being Yul Brynner. And Yul Brynner's girlfriend came up to my father and said, Yul's going to leave his busboy job at the Threefold, and if you want, he's going to start modeling nude at the Art Students League. And so he's gonna, that pays a lot better than the Threefold busboy job, which only paid that you ate that day. You ate at the Threefold, So that's pretty good, to be able to survive. So anyway, she said, so if you want Yul's job, this would be a good time to go for it because he's about to leave. So he went and got Yul Brynner's job, and Yul Brynner had been my mother's busboy. So my father now was replacing Yul Brynner, and, he fell in love with this redheaded Texas girl, and we've always blamed Yul Brynner for the rest of the whole deal.
In the liner notes to the Gillette Brothers' 2003 album, Ridin' with Dayton, Steve Hartz wrote this. Through the town run the tracks where they used to get off the passenger train when they were kids. Perhaps that is the most telling thing of all. Guy and Pip spent much of their childhood in the Northeast, and like so many of the old cowboys and ramblers of song, they have had the perspective of living in totally different worlds. They chose the ranch.
When Guy was being thought of, or being about to be born, they went back to Texas, and the Guy was born in Crockett in 1945. So they went back to be, I always assumed that my mother just wanted to be close to her parents and her family at that time. I assumed, although maybe it was also economic, maybe they realized it would be cheaper to have a baby in Crockett, Texas than in Manhattan. I don't know what the reasoning really was. But he was born in Crockett in 45, and my parents, I always got the impression from their earliest stories that they were hoping and kind of thinking about being sort of partnering a bit with my grandfather. You know, they took out a brand in their own names, and they started thinking about ranching. And my father was working, he thought, with my grandfather, and I think found out that you really didn't work so much with Hoyt as you worked for Hoyt. And he wasn't that open and didn't discuss what he was planning or anything. He just kind of did it, and so you kind of followed along and did what you had to do. But anyway, so that wasn't working out so great, and so they moved back to New York, and my father got a job, started back in the theater, and he ended up in several Broadway shows and things, and really was acting, And then after he said that, the war was over and a lot of guys were coming home, he said, and the competition even got, that much more so. The theater was getting more difficult, he felt like. Anyway, it turned out that a friend of his suggested he see some photographs he'd taken in Texas, actually, because he'd always been interested in photography. And so he'd taken a bunch of pictures in Texas, and this fella worked for a magazine, and he said, "These are great. You ought to, you got to do some work for us." And so suddenly my father borrowed a camera, and he got more serious about photography. He studied with Sid Grossman, who is a rather well-known in the photography world, New York photography teacher, and studied with Sid, and we, used to go and visit him as kids and stuff. That was one of the things that was always interesting about my father's work as a photographer. We'd get to go on assignments, certain situations that we'd end up, meeting J. Frank Dobie and Carl Sandburg and Burl Ives, and, just because we were kids with our father, the photographer, who was there for a real reason, and we were just there, but it was always rather fascinating. And so he ended up started doing photography, and they moved back to New York. They were living in Staten Island, and he was getting, like I said, more and more involved with photography. Edward Steichen was the director of the Modern Museum in New York and putting together the Family of Man show, which was the first time that a photography exhibition was being presented in a museum setting, and photography was being taken seriously as an art form. Up until then, it was just sort of photography, But Edward Steichen put this show together and presented it at the Modern Museum there. And my father had two photographs that Steichen had chosen, one of them being one of his Texas pictures, and one of them being one of Guy and I in our backyard in Yonkers, New York. So this would have been the very early 50s. And the one photograph of my grandparents and Guy and I and my mother all on the front porch of their house, which has sort of become, for my father anyway, kind of an iconic photograph that was used multiple times and for different purposes over the years. It was just sort of used and reused because it was kind of, people think of it as being this sort of family American kind of looking portrait. And then I was born in Staten Island, and they did not do me the favor of coming back to Texas. So I was actually born in Staten Island, which I've always said, an exotic island in the Far East. He was now doing photography. She had left the, Trappecon School of Fashion Design, of course, and we were living in Staten Island, and then about 1951, they were building these new homes for the veterans. And anyway, so they bought this home in Yonkers, New York, and that was about 1951, and that's where we grew up. And so then we would go down to Texas every summer, as often as we could. We would go to Texas. And so we'd spend our summers in Texas, and then we would go to school in New York. If my father was able to go with us, we would drive down, and my father and mother and Guy and I would drive down, which was always interesting. And this, of course, was pre-interstate days, so you would drive literally, every stop sign, every stop light, and, go through all the towns. And you're really seeing the country and the places, And, of course, it was kind of always a big shock to go from New York and then cross the Mason-Dixon line, and now you're suddenly in segregated America, and suddenly you're seeing white water fountain, colored water fountain, white restrooms, colored restrooms, which was always shocking. That's always stood out in our minds and my mind. It was always, and my parents. My mother was part of the reason I think she left Texas at that time was because she was not comfortable with the whole segregated society, and she was looking for something that was a little more open and. So that was certainly one of the big changes when you drove from New York to Texas in those days. And so then if my father couldn't go, we would take the train. And in those days, we could get on, he put us on the train, my mother and Guy and I, in Penn Station in Manhattan. And you'd get on the train, and then you would change trains in St. Louis, Missouri, and went from the Pennsylvania Railroad to the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and then you would get off at the depot in Lovelady, which was unbelievable, to think of today. And my grandmother would be standing on the other side of the train, and because the depot was opposite her store, right, literally opposite her general store, and the tracks were in between. So the train then, when it left, there my grandmother would be waiting for us because she knew we were coming, and the train didn't stop all that often in Lovelady. So that was great fun. That was a great experience, and we really enjoyed those train trips, and of course the other trips too, the driving. They were both great experiences, and so we loved going to Texas in the summers, and then in the winters we would listen to all these records my parents had bought, this was the beginning, I guess, pretty much of Folkways Records, and he was recording all this, I can't think of his name, Mo Ash was recording all kinds of folk music, and that was a huge thing for us because we were always kind of doing our Texas sort of winters. We were boning up for our summers in Texas, So we were listening to Hermes Nye was someone that recorded for Folkways, and he was from Dallas, Texas. He was an attorney, as the way I understand it, but he was a great enthusiast of folk music and recorded a lot of Texas folk music, trail driving tunes and cowboy period. Then he did some that were Civil War era kind of tunes, so he was someone we listened to a great deal. Hermes Nye, Cisco Houston, Jack Elliott, Ed McCurdy. Those were some of the guys that recorded those cowboy stuff that we listened to. And then there were, of course, they played, they had Lead Belly Records, and they had Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and Broadway shows, and classical music, a real variety of stuff. The only kind of music they really were not very interested in was pop music of any kind. They didn't care we didn't grow up listening to anything of that nature. It was like I say, Broadway shows or classical or folk music. And but we would read, my brother would get, because of course Guy was older than I was, he would get Will James novels for Christmas. We'd get one of those Scribner's versions of the Will James books, which of course is a common story. Everybody seemingly that's interested in this genre grew up reading Will James, and we loved Will James, and we'd listen to these cowboy records and then spend summers in Texas with my grandfather and work cattle, and that was what we just couldn't wait to do, and be horseback and help what we could do, work cattle, and spend our summers doing that. And I always said that basically that's what got me through school was the fact that if you failed something, you had to go to summer school Well, if you had to go to summer school, that meant you couldn't go to Texas. So I was determined not to fail anything, and that was my great inspiration, so to go to Texas. And it was just great fun, and we just loved it. And I, of course, Guy and I moved back to Texas in 1983. One of those things where you kind of always hoped and planned on returning to the ranch and wanting to get back there. But it's sort of one of those things that one of these days we'll do that, but we were kind of forced into it, fortunately, by the fact that the guys, a couple of fellas who had the place leased from my grandfather, had neglected to really take care of it. And if you don't mow pastures, the open land in our neck of the woods, it goes back to being woods. It just returns to the big thicket. And so that's what had kind of happened. And so their lease had come up, and we realized that, this cousin of ours wanted to lease it for running cattle. And but he said it's in such bad shape that I want a long lease, because I'm going to have to clear all this land and build new fences and do all this stuff. So I want a 10-year lease. Well, at that time, I was 33 years old, and I was thinking, 10 years, wow, I'd be 43 years old before we could come back here. So that was the kind of sort of frightening realization that this was really the time to do it. So we were, like I say, kind of pressured into doing it, and it was the best thing that ever happened to us. It was great, because otherwise you just kind of, rock along and do what you do, which we, of course, again, back to the music, we grew up hearing this music and playing this music, and then Guy started to play guitar. He had actually, after graduating from high school in 1963, he always, he went back to Texas and was working with my grandfather, but had always wanted to work on a big outfit, wanted to work on one of the bigger ranches, and he ended up working for Wat Matthews at the Lamb's Head Ranch in Albany, Texas. And Watt had done an interview in a magazine article for Fortune magazine, and my father had done a lot of photography for Fortune magazine and knew the writer who had done this story on the Lamb's Head. And so she said, well, you need to call Wat Matthews. Somehow or other it had come up that my brother was looking for work at a ranch in Texas. She said, well, you need to call Wat Matthews. So Guy called Wat Matthews, and Wat was, of course, an amazingly generous, open, kind man, and then said, well, yeah, come on out. And he came out to Albany, and he put him up in a motel room there in town. And that happened to be the Sunday night that the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. So Guy was seeing the Beatles in Albany, Texas, and I was seeing the Beatles in Yonkers, New York, and we were both getting pretty inspired suddenly that looked like a pretty good job. A good way to make a living. And but anyway, so Guy met with Watt, and Watt took him on and said, well, he realized he could saddle a horse and get on it, and wasn't just a kid from New York, and so Guy worked for Watt for about 6 months, I guess, out at the ranch, and was kind of did all the first job kind of stuff, wrangled the horses, and was the low man on the totem pole, but lived there in the bunkhouse, and great experience, and loved it. And then went back to work with my grandfather, and went back to New York and studied at the neighborhood playhouse. He studied acting then, and I was still in high school. And Guy met one of his fellow students was a woman named, or a girl kind of at the time, Diane Keaton was her name. And actually, her name was Diane Hall. And I had started a band in New York at that time, and I was playing drums. We had a band going, and Guy started playing bass in the band. And so this singer named Diane Hall started to sing lead with us, and she did some Aretha Franklin tunes and Grace Slick, Jefferson Airplane songs, and anyway, some of these things. She was a wonderful singer, and when they both graduated from the neighborhood playhouse, she joined Actors Equity, and they said, well, there's already a Diane Hall in Actors Equity, and you can't have two actors with the same name. So she used her mother's maiden name, which was Keaton. So she used Diane Keaton. And she got a job right away doing summer stock in Woodstock, New York, at the theater there. And then right after that, almost immediately got in Hair, the original production of Hair, and she was, kind of a cast member. She had a few songs that she sang in, and then she was an understudy for the lead. And when the lead woman finally left, Diane took over that role, and that's when Woody Allen saw her, and pretty much the rest is history. So we've always taken credit for Diane's her rock and roll initiation, and then immediately into a rock musical. We thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, she is a character. So anyway, in high school, after seeing the Beatles, that's when he started getting interested in playing guitar. I was learning to play the drums, and had a band going, and we were interested in rock and roll and, all this stuff. But at the same time, we would play the cowboy songs. Guy would, because he played guitar. And he'd play Little Joe the Wrangler, and he'd play, these songs that we learned off these great records, and did it just at home. In other words, basically the way those songs were almost intended, just for personal enjoyment and for the guys in the bunkhouse, or the guys on the front porch, or the people in the family. And, they were never really a great entertainment thing. It was never a staged thing, It was mostly it was folk music, And, of course, in that period when those songs were invented, of course, there was nothing but music that you made yourself. If you were going to have music, you had to make it. There was no radio, no recordings, no nothing. So you played music. And so that's where those songs came from. And that's how they were for us. Even when we were playing in these different rock groups that evolved, we were doing other people's material, obviously, for a long time, just trying to learn how to do it, and then evolved into writing our own stuff and everything. And it was all influenced by our various interests in blues and country music and folk music and all these different influences. And so anyway, when the ranch, when we realized we had to really make a decision and come back to Texas in 1983, we had been doing our own material for years, and we came back to Texas, and we thought, well, we were playing a lot of the New York clubs that were Texas. In that particular period, there was a lot of Texas clubs. There was the Lone Star Cafe, and there was these different Texas clubs. This was kind of following the urban cowboy thing, when suddenly you had those bucking bull machines in New Jersey, and all these Italian guys wearing cowboy hats, and all the, it was it was crazy. But there were a few real Texas clubs, dance halls and nightclubs that were, selling Lone Star beer. And Lone Star, certainly Lone Star Cafe, was the sort of preeminent club. It was a funny little strange club in its design and layout. It was not at all conducive to live performance, but it was where you ended up. And they had all kinds of great people, and we used to open a lot of shows for different acts. Doc Pomus, the songwriter, who wrote Save the Last Dance for Me with Mort Schulman, he wrote that. That's certainly probably the best known song I can think of off the top of my head. He was one of those brill-building Lieber Stoller, Carole King songwriters in the brill building, real New York songwriters. And he used to travel all the clubs in New York City. He was had polio as a young person, and he traveled. He was in a wheelchair, and he'd go from nightclub to nightclub to hear the different music, because that's what he was loved. And he was a big friend of the guy who managed the Lone Star Cafe. So when he'd book someone like Delbert McClinton or Coco Taylor or Buckwheat Zydeco or I don't know, some of these different people, he said, well, you need to get the Gillette brothers to open that for that show. You need to get the Gillette brothers. And so the guy would, so we'd do these opening act spots, which would, give us this great, moment in a great crowd of people that were interested in the same kind of music. I mean, it related. It wasn't obviously always the same, but it related. And Doc was a great supporter and tried to get us some record deals with Alligator Records, and he just, he was a great friend. And that was the same period that Odetta was in. Of course, she lived in New York, and she used to go to a lot of the clubs and come and see us too. She, of course, was a friend of Doc Parmus's as well, and she'd come to see us, and so we had this great, little entourage of marvelous folks that were be there. One of the great things Odetta used to say before you'd go on and stay, instead of saying "give 'em hell," like people say, "give 'em hell," she'd say "give 'em heaven." And I always thought that was very cool. And she was a very, very supportive friend and in that period. So we did all these New York clubs and doing original stuff. And we had a songwriting deal with Lieber and Stoller and a publishing deal with them for one period. And anyway, fortunately, in '83, when the ranch needed real help, we have felt like we'd really done it. You know what I mean? We'd really done New York. We'd done the clubs. We'd been reviewed in Variety and the New York Times. Robert Palmer written reviews, and we had all these nice things that sort of happened, and yet nothing was happening. I mean, we were working, constantly. We had a band together with horns, a couple of horn players, and guitarist, and drummer, and guy played bass, and I played rhythm and sang, and we're doing our own stuff. And we traveled from Florida to Maine and up and down, mostly the East Coast, up and down. And so when the ranch needed help, and we felt like it was really a good time for us because we felt we'd really done it. There wasn't a door we hadn't knocked on, so it wasn't like, oh, if we just had one more shot, we felt like, holy smoke, we've really done it all. And we thought a lot of the material the guy was writing and that we were writing was Texas-based stuff, and we were playing these Texas clubs in New York, and we said maybe it'd be a good idea to be in Texas as a Texas band. It kind of occurred to us, amazingly enough. We had kept up Wat Matthews when we came back to Texas. Guy had gotten in touch with Wat, and Wat would invite us back to the ranch, and we would go try to help with different, anytime they had some kind of extra work, spring works or fall works or gathering the bulls or anything that was, that they could use some extra people. And we would go back, and that was first time I, of course, got an opportunity to spend any time out there. And it was just incredible, a wonderful place. And Watt kept it and restored all the places and the buildings and the earlier buildings, and he would restore stuff, and he loved keeping it traditional, as the way he known it his whole life. He was born in 1899, and it was just the most generous. And if you looked up Western hospitality in the dictionary, there'd be a picture of Wat Matthews. And he'd have us come out there. I mean, we end up going out there. And I remember he would actually pay us to work, the days we'd worked. And I remember getting my first check it said cow work, in the memo. He said cow work, Pipp Gillette. I should have framed it. I felt like it. It was the great honor of my life.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'll pick up where I left off with Pipp on part 2 on the next episode, where we will talk about cowboys, minstrels, and medicine shows. I'd like to thank Pipp Gillette for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Pipp at campstreetcafe.com. I'd also like to recommend a book about the Gillette family that features the photography of Pip's father. The book is published by the University of Oklahoma Press. It was written by Andy Wilkinson, and it's titled A Family of the Land, The Texas Photography of Guy Gillette. If you'd like to find out more about me and this show, you can visit andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help support it, you can make a donation on the website. Or you could leave a 5-star rating and a review in the iTunes store, or you could simply tell a friend to give the show a listen. If you'd like to contact me with a comment or a question or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.